This is my second video about Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin and the creation of modern art. It seems to me that the conspiracy theories about modern art are true. That it was funded by wealthy bankers and picture dealers whose beliefs centered around the Kabbalah. And they used modern art and they financed modern art from its inception. So already painters like Gogh were being funded by wealthy Kabbalistic patrons. And they funded modern art to create a new art which was more based on the modern world. And then through this art they would change it and then actually try to sculpt the modern world into the vision of their beliefs, which is based on the Kabbalah. And so we're going to have a look back in time. And this is a painting by Anthony van Dyck. Now, Anthony van Dyck was born in 1599 and he died in 1641. He became the court painter of Charles I of England. And we see him here with a sunflower. We also see him with a chain around his neck, and he's holding the chain and pointing to the sunflower. Now, people do not understand what this symbolism in this picture is about. Is it about his loyalty to the crown? Now, what I think this picture is about is Van Dyck showing you that he was part of what was then called Freemasonry. So officially Freemasonry started in 1717, but it was going on in England for centuries before that time. And you have the sunflower, which is a sun symbol, which is what the Freemasons worship. And in the centre of the sunflower you have an all-seeing eye. So it's clear that it's about sun worship and the secret cult of Freemasonry, which sees the sun as a kind of illuminating God, which illuminates man's knowledge. And he's holding the necklace which shows his loyalty to the secret society. This is what I think it means, and we'll notice that Van Gogh also painted sunflowers, and he's most famous for sunflowers. Here is another portrait by Anthony van Dyck, and this time it's of Sir Kenelm Digby, and he was the royal astrologer for Charles I. And you can see here he has a sunflower. He must have been a Freemason too. And what they're really symbolising is their loyalty to the crown of Freemasonry. Now, in 1649, Charles I had his head chopped off after the English Civil War, and this was the real beginning of the French Revolution. So the first revolution was actually in England, and they wanted to reduce the power of the king, and I believe it was actually created by secret societies. They didn't want the king to have so much power, so they got rid of the king, and later they would do this in the French Revolution. And all your French thinkers like Voltaire were trained by the Grand Lodge in England, and they all visited England before the French Revolution, and their ideas created the French Revolution. But those ideas came from England and the Grand Lodge in England. And when Cromwell took over, Cromwell changed the laws, and he let money dealers and merchants from the European continent come into England. Now, at that time, during the Renaissance and the Baroque period, you had these money lenders who used to lend money to the monarchs. So the monarchs weren't the ones really in control, it was the money lenders behind them. Families like the Medici, who were the biggest collectors of the Kabbalah manuscripts. You also had a family called the Fuggers, and you had Jacob Fugger, and so the Fuggers were like the Rothschilds. But at that time you couldn't say which religion you were originally, so you had a term called conversos. And so these money dealers, money lenders, lent money to the monarch, so they were the real power. And it's interesting that when Charles I was deposed, Cromwell let in a greater and greater amount of these money lenders into England. Now, if we look at Paul Gauguin came from a banking family. He also came from a converso family. And Paul Gauguin was heavily into the Kabbalah. And he had two main influences, which was Eliphas Levi and Madame Blavatsky. And Gauguin was a theosophist. Now, Gauguin's patrons, who were these art dealers and rich bankers, were heavily into the Kabbalah. And they were the ones that funded modern art. As I said, they wanted to create a new world order, and so they funded modern art. And in this painting, Gauguin paints himself as the Baphomet. And you see him here with the snakes which are in the Baphomet's belly, and he was a personal friend of Eliphas Levi. Now, all the French intellectuals at that time were friends of Eliphas Levi. People like Baudelaire. And they were all into spiritualism, contacting spirits, doing seances. And Gauguin was also influenced by Madame Blavatsky, whose ideas went on to influence the dictator who looked like Charlie Chaplin in Germany, and also influenced styles like surrealism. And they were questioning all forms of orthodoxy. So in the Victorian time, you had a very conservative society, and they wanted to change that society and create the society we now have, which is the modern world. And Madame Blavatsky believed that she was in communication with spirits, and that there was a different type of god. So there was a god, a superior god, and then there was the creator god of matter, and he was evil, and that was the god of the Bible. And the thing is, you cannot trust anything Madame Blavatsky said, because she was likely an agent and would not tell the truth to people anyway. So here we have Gogh. He's in the Garden of Eden, and he's been tempted by the apple of knowledge. Here we have in a book called Revelations of Modernism by Albert Bohemy, who was the authority on the subject. He shows you the Kabbalistic and occult roots of modern art, and also how Gogh based his painting on the goat, which was the Baphomet, which was drawn by Eliphas Levi. Eliphas Levi wrote a book called Magic. It influenced Aleister Crowley. Madame Blavatsky's theosophy influenced the Golden Dawn, a secret society in England, W.B. Yeats, and you have painters like Augustus John, and Aleister Crowley was part of the Golden Dawn. So you can see all the connections. They were all into the Kabbalah, and they were financed by rich moneylenders and bankers who were also Kabbalists. In this painting by Van Gogh, now it was said that Gogh encouraged Van Gogh to paint sunflowers, and Van Gogh painted the sunflowers for Gogh. Now Gogh was a Freemason, and this is confirmed, so we know 100% that Gogh was a Freemason. Now what I'm suggesting is that Van Gogh and his brother Theo were both Freemasons. They were also both picture dealers, and Van Gogh came from a very good background, and what I think is that Van Gogh's background was steeped in Freemasonry on both sides, on his mother's side and on his father's side. Now Van Gogh and Theo Van Gogh worked for a art dealers called Goupil. Now Goupil were like the Sotheby's of that time, and they dealt with the international art market in Europe. So they had incredible connections, and Van Gogh's had two uncles who were part owners of Goupil. So it just shows the incredible connections of the Van Goghs. They must have been Freemasons, and it was Theo Van Gogh that made the connection to Gogh, and then Gogh went and visited Van Gogh to create an artist's colony. Now they had a third friend called Emile Bernard. Emile Bernard was a theosophist, follower of Blavatsky, who was also a Freemason. And in a letter to Van Gogh says, I want to create an artist's colony, but I don't want it to be based on Freemasonry because I don't like following rules. So it shows you that Van Gogh must have been a Freemason. And the reason why this image is so popular of the sunflowers is it has something to do with Freemasonry. And in this painting, which is now lost by Van Gogh, it was in Japan, you can clearly see he puts an all-seeing eye in the middle of the sunflower. Now in America, I think it's in Kansas, they actually have the sunflower lodge. So the sunflower represents the sun as an all-seeing eye, and its petals and its seeds, Freemasons see that as them, as being part of that organisation. Now Gogh also painted the sunflowers after Van Gogh's death, and in it he clearly has an all-seeing eye here. So he clearly puts an all-seeing eye. You can see that Gogh went to Tahiti. He was influenced by the ideas of mysticism of Helena Blavatsky and Buddhism and talking to spirits, and that's what his paintings have in Tahiti. They have images where you have kind of demonic spirits, and then you have an all-seeing eye there. In this portrait of Van Gogh painting the sunflowers, which he painted when he was with Van Gogh, he clearly saw that Van Gogh was someone who suffered from mental health problems, and Gogh was very cruel, and he painted Van Gogh as if he was retarded. And what I'm going to suggest is that there's been new theories that Van Gogh was actually murdered by a small boy. Now, what I'm going to suggest in this video is that was Van Gogh's murder deliberate? Because at the end of his life, he was starting to become famous, and his paintings started to have value. Did they get rid of Van Gogh? And then did they get rid of Theo Van Gogh, who died at 33, so that they could create the Van Gogh art market and sell his works and make huge amounts of money for picture dealers? So there is a new theory that Van Gogh was actually murdered by a boy in an accident, but I think it was on purpose, because Van Gogh stayed with this character called Dr. Gachet, and Dr. Gachet was a Freemason, and he was a doctor. He was into the same things as Gauguin, a friend of Gauguin, and a friend of the other Masonic artists in modern art. And he is the one that looked after Van Gogh, and he let Van Gogh die. So Van Gogh could have actually survived the bullet wound, but because of the poor treatment of Dr. Gachet, Van Gogh died. We're already forging Van Goghs, and so they knew that the Van Gogh paintings were going to be sold for a huge amount of money in the future, and there would be a myth about Van Gogh. And the Gachets remained secret all their lives. They had a secret collection of art worth millions and millions and millions of pounds. So there was a vested interest to get rid of Van Gogh and then create the myth of Van Gogh and sell his paintings for millions of pounds to the benefit of art dealers. So once they used him, they got rid of him. We have this famous portrait of Van Gogh, and it is actually a fake. It was painted by a painter called Schufenecker, who was a friend of Paul Gauguin, and who came into the possession of Van Gogh's paintings after Van Gogh's death. So after Van Gogh died, the paintings went to Theo van Gogh and his wife, and then Theo van Gogh died, and the paintings were looked after and restored by a family friend called Schufenecker. And Schufenecker was a confirmed Freemason. This is him here, and he was also a theosophist. And Gauguin actually slept with his wife, and he is the man that painted this painting. And this painting is in the Occult, and it's probably worth around £200 million, even though it's a fake. And what I'm suggesting in this video is that Van Gogh's paintings have some kind of Freemasonic history to them, with the sunflower being the most famous painting of the modern age, which is a clear reference to Freemasonry. He also painted shoes, which is another Freemasonic symbol, and chairs, which is another. In Masonic temples, in the Grand Lodge of England, they make a huge thing of chairs, of large chairs, when you visit the Grand Lodge. And so there seems to be a clear connection. And then the person who was supposed to be looking after him, Dr. Gogh, who was a picture forger, was also a Freemason, and who let him die. So what I want to show in this video is how modern art was funded and created by people with this occult agenda. And you can see it in the works of Vincent van Gogh. And is it possible that Vincent van Gogh was actually murdered so that other people would benefit from the money which would then be generated from his work? And they would have to get rid of Theo van Gogh, because Theo van Gogh knew which paintings were original and which ones would be fake. And getting rid of Theo van Gogh made that there was far more Van Goghs available, because so many were being forged by people like Dr. Gogh and Schufenecker. Okay, thank you very much.